Hey everybody, Dr. Tammy here. I've been doing a series on stress, and part two in that series was about addictions. And what I find are that addictions are our body's or our mind's way of self-soothing stress. And so sometimes we don't even realize we have addictions, especially if it's to food, because we have to eat to live. But sugar specifically can be a real problem. So as you're moving forward and you're looking at New Year's resolutions and that kind of thing, I want to just kind of go through a little bit of specifically sugar addiction. And so just a couple of questions I want you to think about. You might want to get out a notebook and a pen and just kind of write these answers down. And there's really no right or wrong answer, but just kind of be mindful, because the first thing you need to do is just kind of think, oh, wow, do I have a problem with this? So my first question would be, do you have sugar daily or at least every other day? So things like cookies or pastries, are you constantly looking for Little Debbie's or something like that? You know, every meal, are you kind of thinking, oh, there should be some sugar with that? And do you often think you'll feel better indulging in some kind of sugar? You think that will kind of soothe you in the moment, and then afterwards you usually feel worse. Do you eat too much sugar to the point of feeling sick sometimes? When you eat sugar, does it make you just want more of it? Do you have a hard time stopping at a small serving, like just one cookie? Do you have to have 3 or 4 cookies? Can you eat just a bite of cheesecake, or do you have to have literally a whole slice or 2 slices? Do you overeat sugar when you eat it, like go off the deep end and eat a lot of it? When you eat sugar, does it seem like it's beyond your control, like you feel like you have to eat it? And have you ever tried stop eating sugar and maybe just did it for a little while but just went right back to it and could not stay off of it? Do you hide sugar from family or friends so they don't know you're eating it? Do you keep Snickers bars in the bedside nightstand? Do you feel an impulse to eat it when you see it, like you have to eat it or like it's drawing you to it? And does it feel like it's never enough? Yet you eat it once and you want it over and over and over again. And do you often feel ashamed or guilty when you indulge in sugar, even if nobody knows that you did it? Do you often tell yourself, this is the last time I'm doing this and I'm not going to overeat anymore? And then you think it's the last time and then you just do it again. Are you tired a lot, especially in the late afternoons? And how many years have you struggled with a sugar issue? This is important to kind of think about. When did this first start? And rate your sugar addiction on a scale of 1 to 10. Would you rate your sugar addiction, 1 being least to 10 the worst, and kind of measure that? And so as I give you some tips and some ideas, you'll want to reevaluate this and kind of see where you're at on this scale later. And are you experiencing enough frustration that you're ready to actually do something about it? Well, let's face it, we all have to eat, and we all like sugar. Sugar's a nice little comfort food, and sugar's in everything. We had this low-fat trend, probably about 25 years ago in our country. People thought if you eat fat, it'll make you fat. So what they did was, when they went low-fat, everything was replaced with sugar. And we found that cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and strokes has actually gone up. And that's because we're just eating more sugars. When you read ingredients on labels, you'll see usually the first ingredient sugar or high fructose corn syrup. So sugar is in everything. And if you eat a lot of processed food, you're just more prone to get sugar. And people don't even think about sugar in forms of carbs like breads and pastas. Those are more complex sugars, but they're still sugars nonetheless. So one of the questions I could have asked you before was, do you feel like you have to eat bread with every meal? Do you feel like if you don't have bread or pasta or something, that the meal's not complete? So, carbs can come up that way too. So we all like sugar. Sugar's great. Sugar's kind of socialized into our system too. Grandma's cookies, and, if we bump our knee, our parents can't really deal with the stress of us being upset, so they offer us a sucker or a cookie or something. So, a lot of that's environmentally. But however, many of us are genetically prone, and they have done studies, PET scans on people's brains, and they have shown that actually that sugar addicts have different light ups in the brain in different areas. So very interesting. And we know through these PET scans and through different genetic studies, that some people are really genetically prone to be sugar addicts. It's interesting because alcoholics, I'm not saying you're an alcoholic if you're a sugar addict, but alcoholics are probably sugar addicts because alcohol is actually a sugar. And the way the liver metabolizes sugars, because the liver can actually make its own sugar, that's why some diabetics say they're not eating any sugar, but the liver continues to produce sugar. They'll wake up with a high blood sugar in the morning. So the liver can make its own sugar. So that's kind of interesting in the way our brain chemistry and genetics work too. So it's kind of like our body overrides. If we're not eating the sugar, it's going to make its own sugar. But we want to limit our environmental sources of sugar so that we can override some of those genetics that are at play. And, I think that it's not your fault. If you have those genetics, it's not your fault. You are prone. There are areas in your brain that light up. Your liver metabolizes sugar differently. And so it can be very, very hard if you have a sugar addiction to break that. But one of the things that I want to tell you is the good news is that there's something called epigenetics. So environmentally, nutritionally, through exercise and different things that you do, you can override that sugar addiction. Well, as far as talking about genetics, though, some people actually need more stimulation to feel pleasure driving a reward center in the brain. So, a lot of people who do drugs or alcohol or compulsive gambling, things like that, their pleasure centers are not as easily upregulated or triggered, and so it takes more and more and more of those activities. In the addictions part, I talked about people that are addicted to methamphetamines and things like that. They need more and more and more to upregulate something called dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is a neurochemical that's responsible for our pleasure center, so we feel really, really good when we have lots of dopamine. But it also is part of the addiction process too, because if it's harder to regulate those dopamine receptors, then it's going to take more and more of whatever it is that's the stimulus to make you feel good. And we call that the reward center in the brain. And so, if you are struggling because you have a genetically low trigger or your wiring is not quite right genetically for your pleasure center, you're going to need more than the average person actually needs. So you can override this and reprogram your brain chemistry. So that's all very exciting. And there are specific nutrients that can do that. So in those brain receptors, when I talked about dopamine, those brain receptors are D2, also called DRD2, and they must be activated or switched on to make us feel pleasure. And so people who have sugar addictions or a genetic propensity to sugar addictions, it takes more dopamine to turn on those receptors, and so you have to do more of the activity or more of the sugar or more of the drug to upregulate those receptors. So anyway, what we want to do is we want to use specific nutrients to help regulate those receptors. And we've known for a long time, I've done a lot of research on methylfolate, which is not folic acid. It is the purified form of the B vitamin folate. And unfortunately, they put folic acid in everything because it's dirt cheap, but it's not the same thing. Folate is one of those main nutrients, and I usually recommend the 5-methylfolate to properly get into the cells, but that is one of the nutrients that can actually help with brain addictions because it upregulates those dopamine receptors. I think it's really interesting that functional MRI studies of both thin people and obese people find that obese people's brains don't light up as much in the dopamine reward center. So they're more likely to gain weight and they're more likely to have these sugar addictions. So there are, before I get into more nutrients that can help, there are actually some medications that I use occasionally. I use almost all nutraceuticals and vitamins to treat people. I've totally gotten out of the insurance game and the pharmaceutical game that kind of chases each other. But there are a few medications that I will use occasionally, and one of those that you might want to research is called naltrexone, and we use that sometimes for alcohol or drug addictions, but it can actually help with sugar addiction as well. And what we find is that when people are taking this, it's a opiate, kind of a mid-range opiate blocker, and so those reward centers in the brain are not as difficult to fire up, and so the receptors are not less down-regulated when you take this naltrexone. So that's one medication. And interestingly, we have so many people with ADHD, and ADHD is on that same gene where methylfolate, actually you can have those genetic deficiencies in the ability to to work with, or your body's metabolism of folate. But interestingly, that same area is treated with methylfolate. And so for people with attention deficit disorder, it's interesting because we usually treat with amphetamines. Well, amphetamines actually upregulate those receptors, and they actually reduce food cravings by doing that. So a lot of times we'll use stimulants like phentermine and things like that to upregulate those receptors just a little bit. But I don't recommend that because it is a chemical structure similar to adrenaline, and over time that can suppress your adrenal function. So try not to use those stimulants if at all possible. So talking a little bit more about supplements, I mentioned the methylfolate. There are over 50 genetic defects with supplements that can help with the regulation of them. I'm not going to get into all of those, but I just want to say that there are many nutrients that can affect gene variants. And there is the science of epigenetics, and that is basically that your environmental effect, your nutrition, exercise, all that can override the genetic effects. And in fact, a third of our DNA is completely geared for receiving those environmental factors and the things that we do, the foods that we eat and the exercise that we do. And so it's dependent on those environmental factors. So I think of it like a factory. And so if your factory makes, let's say, Barbie dolls, you can change that factory, which is the DNA inside the cell that makes things, by supplying it with the stuff to make rubber balls or supplying it with the stuff to make wooden blocks. So you're not stuck with your DNA, and that's the beauty of epigenetics. And then there's also the term nutrigenomics, and that is when nutrients get into the DNA, like folate and some of the other things that I'm going to talk about, they can actually change the factory and the way it works to do different things. So like I say, I use a lot of methylfolate in my practice. I see a lot of addictive depression, stress, a lot of diabetes and obesity and attention deficit and autism. And so methylfolate is usually the first thing I start with. There are also other amino acids like glutamine that are wonderful. And when we get specifically to a little more nutrients here in a second, I'm going to kind of break those down for you and what they do. But it's interesting because those neurotransmitters affect appetite and cravings, and they're very complex. So we have to regulate our blood sugar, we have to regulate our stress, we have to get enough sleep, and we have to identify those nutrient deficiencies. So the next thing I want to say, I'm going to get into 5 action steps to relieve your sugar addiction. But I want you to remember that it's not your fault. If you have the sugar addiction, your brain is just wired differently. So here's what you can do to override that. The first thing I recommend, and most traditional doctors don't do this, is to check an insulin level, because if your blood sugar is normal, your insulin should be very low if you're fasting, and you want a fasting insulin. And so what happens is when people's insulin levels are high, that means it's not working very well because the body's just pumping it. And so we call that insulin resistance. And you can actually detect prediabetes before the blood sugar starts to elevate. So it's a great test, and I usually say 20 they call is an elevated insulin level. When it gets to about 10, you're starting to become insulin resistant. So that's the level where I start telling patients, we got to do something about this. So we got to reduce your sugar, we got to get you exercising, and we got to get you on specific supplements. So there is a vicious cycle of the sugar, insulin. And if you wake up first thing in the morning and you eat a donut and a Coke, you're going to be chasing your insulin sugar all day long. So the first thing you can do is when you wake up first thing in the morning is eat protein. And I usually tell my patients, don't eat any sugar of any kind, no carbs, until at least after noon or 1 o'clock. So keep protein high, and that can be low lean animal protein, nuts, seeds, beans, things like that. So, I'm not saying eat a bunch of fatty protein, but protein will keep you fuller, and it will help those insulin spikes from coming. And eat some protein about every 3 to 4 hours, because what's going to happen is those insulin sugar are going to just be chasing each other, and protein almost completely shuts that down. And then when you have sugar, you start that roller coaster again. So the best thing you can do is just eat more protein. I tell people that you got to eliminate refined sugars, and this is sodas and fruit juices, and artificial sweeteners are terrible because they disrupt the gut. And I talk to my patients a lot about leaky gut. I mean, you know, I have whole talks on just leaky gut and food sensitivities, but they disrupt the gut and your ability to absorb nutrients. And so if you can't absorb your nutrients, your DNA is going to be all out of whack. So we have to just kind of stop the madness. And, you know, when you wake up first thing tomorrow morning, have a plan in advance. You know, maybe boil you some eggs and have those ready first thing when you wake up, so you're not looking for the donuts or you're not looking for the sugary cereal and that kind of thing. So anyway, make an effort to start cutting down on those things right away. Food allergies, I kind of mentioned, you know, even artificial sweeteners tear up the gut for the leaky gut. There are many, many foods that you may not even be aware are triggering inflammation. And when you trigger inflammation in the gut, cortisol gets secreted. And when cortisol gets secreted, your insulin levels get out of whack and your sugar goes up. So it's a vicious cycle there as well. So I highly recommend that you get food sensitivity testing. We do that in our office through a blood test. And you might not even know that you have food sensitivities because it might just be affecting your insulin and your blood sugar levels. It may not be causing any gastrointestinal distress or anything like that. So inflammation's huge, and starting with those food sensitivities is very, very important. The next thing is get plenty of sleep, because when you're tired, you're going to want more sugar during the day because it's instant energy. So you're going to want to, you know, look for that sugar to try to stay awake. So get plenty of sleep. And if your hormones are out of balance, get those checked and get those balanced, because especially menopausal women or perimenopausal women or women with PCOS, if your progesterone is low, your sleep's going to be terrible. So you might want to supplement with some natural progesterone so that you get good sleep quality. And then, you know, whatever you need to do, downsize your life, get it where you can, you know, get your sleep, because you're just going to make yourself sick if you say, well, I only need 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night because my job demands it. I mean, that's crazy. You're just going to make yourself sick, and then you can't perform on your job. So you owe it to your job and you owe it to those around you to get that sleep. So it's very, very important. And then get tested for nutrient deficiencies. So in our office, we check for vitamin D, we check for B12, we check for iron levels. All of those impact you very much. So I'm going to talk specifically about some nutrients that can go with that testing. So get your vitamin D levels checked. And if it's low, get on good vitamin D supplementation. I usually recommend 5,000 to 10,000 international units a day. You know, probably need 10,000 in the wintertime because we don't get sun exposure. 5,000 during the summer is probably fine. But vitamin D is a hormone that helps turn off your appetite. So if that's not working, you're going to feel hungry all the time too. And vitamin D is essential for your immune system to function properly and to not trigger that inflammation that goes along with food sensitivities and things like that. Very important. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatories, also known as fish oil. You've got to take a good quality fish oil. You can't take the cheap stuff. It's like literally wringing out a fish into a capsule if you get the cheap stuff. So you want good quality. And it is essential for normal brain function, for insulin control, and for inflammation. So those omegas are very, very important. And then there's some other supplements. I mentioned amino acids like glutamine. I usually recommend about 1,000 to 3,000 milligrams of glutamine. Glutamine also treats leaky gut. Acts like spackling in the intestinal wall. And so if you ever had a hole in your wall and spackled it, that's what it does in your intestines. Tyrosine and 5-HTP, which is a serotonin and the precursors to serotonin, are amino acids that can help with food cravings and with sugar cravings and with mood. And they also help with sleep as well. And chromium is essential. Chromium helps balance blood sugar, and I usually recommend that people take magnesium with chromium because people who are insulin resistant, insulin stores magnesium. So if you're magnesium deficient, chromium's not going to work as well. So magnesium I usually recommend start with 250 milligrams. It is a smooth muscle relaxer, so it can give you smooth muscle relaxation in the bowel wall, and it can give you a little diarrhea, but that's great if you have constipation. Start with 250 milligrams though. I usually like a chelated magnesium, and increase the amount until basically you get diarrhea. So you don't want to get too much magnesium, but usually 250 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams a day is great. And then I also recommend different fibers. One of the best fibers is glucomannan, and fiber will bind up the sugar in the gut, and then you won't absorb as much sugar. So that helps insulin cravings and insulin control. And chromium or fiber is wonderful for just keeping the bowels moving regularly, and again for that insulin sugar stability. So some great supplements. Hope this was helpful for you. You might want to watch this again with a notebook and a pen, take some notes, but sugar addiction is real. It's probably not your fault if you have the genetics for it. So lots of different things you can do. So hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope this was helpful. And stay tuned because we're going to do part 3, I guess, part 4 now on stress, and going to have some really great stuff for you. So stay fabulous. See you soon.